A skilled vigilante infiltrates a mafia hideout to bring down a ruthless kingpin. But as the final blow lands, a shocking revelation threatens to upend everything he thought he knew. Daniel Esquivel rolled his wheelchair to the window, his eyes scanning the cityscape beyond the glass. The faint hum of life outside felt distant, like a melody he could no longer join. Since the accident, the once vibrant streets had become a grim stage for shadows. He had traded bustling days for solitude in the small apartment he shared with Maria, his sister and lifeline, to the world he had abandoned. Maria's laughter, however rare these days, echoed down the hall as she entered the apartment. A school bag hung over one shoulder, and a stack of papers balanced precariously in her hands. She paused briefly to look at Daniel, her eyes flickering with concern before she softened her tone. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her things on the kitchen counter. Daniel shrugged. "Quiet, like always." She leaned against the counter, her expression a mixture of weariness and determination. Maria, a dedicated teacher, spent her days molding young minds, shielding her students from the darker truths of the city. But tonight she seemed especially drained, her usual resolve weighed down by something unseen. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, wheeling closer. Maria hesitated, then forced a smile. "Just a long day. The usual chaos." Chaos. The word carried more weight than it should in a city suffocated by Carlos Mendonza's grip. Mendonza's name was spoken in hushed tones, a phantom whose reach extended into every corner. The Mafia's influence bled into schools, markets, and homes, leaving no sanctuary untouched. Daniel frowned but didn't press further. He knew Maria well enough to recognize when she was shielding him. Since the accident, she had become fiercely protective, taking on the role of both sister and caretaker. It was a dynamic Daniel resented but couldn't escape. Later that evening, Maria busied herself grading papers at the dining table, while Daniel skimmed through an old novel he'd read countless times. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, but neither dared to address it. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the city outside fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional screech of tires or distant shouts. It was during one of these lulls that Maria's phone buzzed, startling them both. She picked it up, her face tensing as she read the message. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, sensing her shift. She nodded too quickly. "Just a reminder about tomorrow's meeting." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He watched her closely as she gathered her papers and retreated to her room. Something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what. The next day, Maria's usual commute to work felt heavier than usual. As she walked through the neighborhood, the signs of Mendonza's stranglehold were impossible to ignore. Closed shops with shattered windows, graffiti marking gang territories, and faces that avoided eye contact. She quickened her pace, clutching her bag tightly. It was near the school that she saw it, a crime unfolding in plain sight. A man knelt on the ground, blood pooling around him, as two others stood over him, their faces partially obscured. Maria froze, her breath caught in her chest. She knew she should look away, keep walking, pretend she hadn't seen, but her feet refused to move. One of the men noticed her, his gaze locking onto hers like a predator. He nudged his partner, and they exchanged a glance before stepping toward her. Maria's instincts finally kicked in. She turned and walked away as calmly as she could, her heart pounding with every step. Behind her, she could hear their voices, low and menacing, but she didn't dare look back until she reached the school's gates. Inside the safety of the building, she tried to steady herself, but her hands trembled as she clutched her desk. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed an invisible line, one that now tied her to the dangers lurking outside. That evening, when she returned home, Maria's usual cheer was gone. Daniel noticed the tension in her movements, the way her eyes darted toward the window as if expecting someone to appear. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. She hesitated, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said finally, forcing a smile. But Daniel could see the truth she wasn't saying. The shadows of the city had found their way to their doorstep, and he had a sinking feeling they weren't going to leave. The scent of dinner still lingered in the air when chaos erupted. Daniel sat in his worn armchair, lost in the faint glow of the television, while Maria hummed softly in the kitchen. The serenity shattered with the splintering of wood as the front door burst open. Shadows flooded the living room, dark figures carrying the promise of violence. Maria screamed. Her voice, a desperate cry for help, echoed through the small house, but no one came. Daniel's world slowed as he tried to stand, his legs trembling under the weight of shock and his weakened body. Before he could take a step, a heavy fist slammed into his chest, sending him crashing to the floor. "Stay down, old man," one of the intruders growled, his voice sharp and devoid of mercy. Through blurred vision, Daniel watched as Maria was dragged into the center of the room. Her eyes locked onto his, wide with terror, but also pleading for him to remain still, to stay alive. A man with a scarred face, a face Daniel would never forget, stepped forward, his movements calculated and cold. Without hesitation, the man drew a knife, and the world dissolved into Maria's final, piercing scream. Blood pooled across the cracked wooden floor. Daniel's chest heaved as his breaths turned to gasps, the weight of the scene crushing him. The men looked at him, their expressions laced with disdain. "He's nothing," Scarred Face muttered. "Just a crippled fool. Let him rot here." The group left, their laughter a cruel punctuation to the nightmare they had unleashed. The door slammed shut, leaving silence, except for the faint, hollow echo of Maria's last moments. Daniel didn't cry. He couldn't. His body was frozen, his mind refusing to fully process what had just happened. Minutes passed, maybe hours, before his trembling hand reached for Maria. She was gone, her warmth replaced by a cold stillness. The room felt foreign, as if he had stepped into someone else's life. And then something shifted. The pain was unbearable, but underneath it, a fire began to burn. Memories he had long buried surfaced, missions carried out in the shadows, training that turned a young man into a weapon, and the names of those who had fallen by his hand. He had walked away from that life, but it had never truly left him. It had been waiting, dormant for a moment like this. Daniel rose, his legs steadier now. His gaze swept across the room, landing on a picture of him and Maria taken on their anniversary. He picked it up, his fingers tracing her face. The fire grew into resolve. He would not mourn passively. He would not let Maria's death be a forgotten tragedy. The Daniel they had left alive was not the man they assumed him to be. They had left a ghost, a specter from a past steeped in blood and precision. He had sworn never to return to that world, but now he saw no other path. Standing amidst the remnants of his shattered life, Daniel made a silent vow. He would find Scarred Face, he would find Carlos, and one by one, he would make them pay. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, illuminating the blood-stained floor, Daniel began to plan. Daniel's heart pounded as he stood in the dimly lit corner of the workshop. The stale air smelled of rust and oil, mingling with the faint hum of the buzzing fluorescent light above him. His fingers worked methodically, transforming everyday objects into tools of resistance. A steel rod became a makeshift crowbar, a discarded length of chain morphed into a whip-like weapon, and a worn-out leather glove was reinforced with shards of glass along the knuckles. His mind, sharpened by years of survival, broke the overwhelming task into smaller, manageable steps. The first was preparation. He couldn't confront the Mafia empty-handed, nor could he rely on strength alone. His edge would be his strategy, a blend of calculated precision and the element of surprise. For days, he studied them. From a perch above a decrepit warehouse, Daniel observed the movements of the Mafia's foot soldiers. They followed routines, predictable patrols, careless conversations over cigarettes, and moments of arrogance that left vulnerabilities wide open. He noted the vehicles that came and went, the way the men interacted, and which doors were guarded or weren't. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle. By night, he scrawled rough maps onto scraps of paper, marking weak points in their defenses. His plans took shape in quiet isolation, interrupted only by the echo of distant car alarms and the occasional bark of stray dogs in the night. The city was alive, yet indifferent, a perfect backdrop for his quiet rebellion. Daniel knew he couldn't do this alone. Reluctantly, he reached out to old contacts, individuals he'd once sworn to leave behind. It wasn't easy. Trust in his world was a fragile thing. A coded message to Marco, a former informant, led to a cautious meeting in a back alley. Marco, older and wearier than Daniel remembered, provided the intel he needed. A shipment scheduled for Thursday night, the names of key players, and confirmation of their safe house location. "These men are monsters, Daniel," Marco warned, his voice trembling. "You don't just cross them. You vanish, or they make you vanish." Daniel's jaw tightened. Then they'll learn that some things can't be erased. He also sought help from Elena, a resourceful woman with a knack for acquiring what others couldn't. She provided blueprints of the warehouse and an encrypted radio. Though hesitant, her eyes revealed a flicker of admiration for Daniel's resolve. Armed with knowledge and makeshift tools, Daniel felt the momentum shift. Each step he took felt like defiance against the shadow that loomed over his life. The fear was still there, a gnawing presence at the edge of his thoughts. But it no longer paralyzed him. It fueled him. As he stood by the open window of his apartment, the city stretched out before him, a labyrinth of danger and opportunity. Daniel whispered to himself, "This isn't revenge, this is survival." The plan was in motion. The dim light of the harbor barely illuminated the docked cargo ship, its shadow stretching over the murky water like a sleeping beast. Daniel stood in the darkness, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the truck being loaded with crates. Each crate represented a fortune in narcotics, a lifeline for Carlos's criminal empire, and his first target. Crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, Daniel adjusted his tactical vest and checked his gear one final time. Everything was in place. The explosives, the ammunition, the escape route. His mind was a machine, calculating every move and contingency. Tonight wasn't about revenge, it was about precision, sending a message that Carlos wouldn't forget. The muffled conversations of the Mafia's men reached him. They were relaxed, unaware of the storm about to descend. Daniel's lips curled into a cold smile. That complacency was their first mistake. He moved silently, a shadow within shadows, placing charges on key points of the ship and the trucks. Each step was deliberate, each motion practiced. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the faint metallic scent of oil. Daniel welcomed it. It sharpened his focus. As he climbed onto the ship, he encountered the first guard. The man barely had time to register the glint of steel before Daniel's blade found its mark. Silent, swift, and deadly. He dragged the body into the shadows and continued, his pulse steady, his mind clear. The final crate was being loaded into the truck when Daniel took his position. He raised his rifle, the scope aligning with the lead driver's chest. A single breath, a single shot. The man crumpled and chaos erupted. The guards shouted, scrambling to locate the attacker. Daniel picked them off methodically, one by one, sowing panic with every silenced shot. When their numbers thinned, he triggered the charges. Explosions ripped through the night, shaking the dock and lighting the sky with fiery plumes. The ship groaned as flames consumed its hull, spilling cargo and smoke into the air. Amidst the chaos, Daniel descended on the remaining men like a predator. His movements were calculated, efficient, no wasted bullets, no hesitation. The last of Carlos's soldiers fell, their lifeless bodies sprawled amidst the wreckage. Daniel stood amidst the destruction, his chest rising and falling with the exertion. Smoke billowed around him, carrying the acrid stench of burning chemicals and scorched metal. He glanced at his watch, right on schedule. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, he retreated into the shadows, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The dock was unrecognizable, cargo destroyed, men dead, and the ship sinking slowly into the water. The Mafia's lifeline had been severed in one ruthless stroke. Miles away, in a lavish penthouse, Carlos stared at the newsfeed on his phone. His face darkened as reports of the attack reached him. He crushed the glass in his hand, blood dripping onto the table. His men whispered nervously, exchanging glances. Who could strike with such precision? An enemy? A traitor? Unbeknownst to Carlos, his empire had just faced the first move in a much larger game. Daniel's war had begun. Ana Velasquez adjusted her recorder as the rain pattered against the narrow streets of the city. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows, making her surroundings feel eerily alive. She was no stranger to danger, but the recent attacks against the Mafia had stirred a curiosity she couldn't ignore. Someone was systematically dismantling an empire and no one seemed to know who or why. To Ana, this was more than a story. It was the kind of truth that could define her career. Her leads had brought her to a dingy cafe, frequented by low-level enforcers of Carlos Alvarado, the feared Mafia boss. Ana observed from a corner table, her dark hair tucked beneath a cap and her eyes scanning the room for any signs of unrest. Conversations were hushed, but the tension was palpable. Whispers of betrayal rippled through the ranks, and Carlos himself was rumored to be questioning the loyalty of his closest men. As Ana sipped her coffee, a figure caught her attention. A man, clad in a leather jacket, slipped into the cafe with the ease of someone accustomed to blending in. His gaze swept the room, pausing momentarily on her before moving on. It was subtle, but enough to set her on edge. Something about him didn't fit. He moved too deliberately, like a predator stalking unseen prey. Unbeknownst to Anna, Daniel knew exactly who she was. He had been monitoring her for days, wary of her growing interest in the attacks. If she got too close, she could unravel everything he had worked to conceal. For Daniel, anonymity was his shield, and Anna's relentless pursuit of the truth threatened to expose him. When Anna stood to leave, Daniel followed, his footsteps silent against the wet pavement. She ducked into an alley, her instincts sharpened by years of navigating dangerous terrain. As she turned a corner, she collided with him. "Careful," he said, his voice low, steady. His grip on her arm was firm but not aggressive. Anna looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. "Do I know you?" "You don't want to," he replied, releasing her arm and stepping back. "You should leave this alone." Anna's brow furrowed, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "Are you saying you know something about the attacks?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He hadn't meant to reveal anything, but her persistence was unnerving. "Just stay out of it," he said before disappearing into the shadows. Left alone in the alley, Anna felt her heart racing. Whoever he was, he knew something. And now, more than ever, she was determined to find out what. Meanwhile, across the city, Carlos Alvarado sat in his lavish office, the air heavy with cigar smoke. His lieutenants stood before him, their nervous energy betraying the fear they felt in his presence. Carlos was no fool. Someone within his organization had to be aiding the attacks. His cold eyes scanned the room, calculating and unforgiving. "We will find them," Carlos growled, his voice like the rumble of a distant storm. "And when we do, they will beg for mercy." Anna stood motionless, her eyes fixed on Daniel, the weight of her discovery pressing heavily on her chest. The room was dimly lit, the flickering bulb casting uneven shadows on the walls. In her hand, a folder filled with documents trembled slightly, its edges worn from hours of scrutiny. Daniel, seated in his wheelchair by the window, sensed her presence but didn't turn. Instead, his gaze remained locked on the rain streaking down the glass, as though it could wash away the secret she was about to confront him with. "You've been lying to me," Anna said, her voice low but steady. The accusation hung in the air like an electric charge. Daniel exhaled deeply, his shoulders tensing. "I never lied. I just didn't tell you everything." "Don't twist words," Anna snapped, stepping closer. She threw the folder onto the small table beside him. Pages spilled out, each one bearing pieces of a puzzle she had painstakingly assembled. "You're not who you said you were, Daniel." Daniel turned slowly, his face etched with weariness. "And now you know. What will you do about it?" His tone was calm, almost resigned, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. Anna pulled a chair and sat across from him, her expression a mix of frustration and resolve. "Why hide it? I could have helped you if I'd known who you really were." Daniel leaned back, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. "I wasn't sure if I could trust you," he admitted. "Not when everyone I've ever trusted has either betrayed me or ended up dead." The tension in the room thickened, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window. Anna's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. "The accident wasn't an accident, was it?" she asked, her voice softer now but laced with certainty. Daniel's jaw tightened, his silence more damning than any confession. After a long pause, he spoke. "It was Carlos," he said, the name laced with venom. "He orchestrated it all. He wanted me out of the way, and he succeeded." Anna's breath caught. She had suspected corruption and manipulation in her investigations, but hearing it confirmed was different. "Why would he target you?" she asked. Daniel's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Because I found out too much. About him, about his deals, about the people he's destroyed to keep his empire intact. He couldn't risk me exposing him." For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of Daniel's revelation settled between them like an invisible wall. Anna's heart ached for the man before her, his life dismantled piece by piece. She hesitated, then reached for the folder. "There's information here," she said, flipping through the pages. "Contacts, patterns, gaps in his operations. It's not much, but it's something." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "How did you get this?" Anna met his gaze, unflinching. "I have my ways," she replied. "The question is, do you want to use it?" Daniel studied her, his skepticism evident. But beneath it, there was a glimmer of hope, a faint spark he hadn't felt in years. "Why would you help me?" he asked finally. Anna hesitated, the truth catching in her throat. "Because I've seen what people like Carlos can do," she said, and because I can't stand by and let him destroy anyone else. A fragile truce formed between them, built on shared pain and a mutual enemy. The rain outside began to slow, the steady rhythm fading into a quiet drizzle. As Anna closed the folder and stood to leave, she turned back to Daniel. "This isn't just your fight anymore," she said firmly. "If we're going to take Carlos down, we'll do it together." Daniel watched her go, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose, a chance to reclaim what he had lost. And this time, he wasn't alone. The low hum of the city seemed more sinister that evening, as Daniel sat in his dimly lit apartment, scanning a map of Carlos's known operations. His meticulous plan to dismantle the Mafia's grip was already in motion, but an unexpected message froze him mid-thought. A voice recording, crackling with static, played on his phone. "She's in our hands now. You know what we want." It was Anna's voice at the end, fearful, trembling, then abruptly cut off. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on him. Daniel's mind raced. Anna, the one person who'd become his reluctant ally in this storm, was now a pawn in Carlos's game. The Mafia had uncovered their connection and seized her, likely aiming to draw Daniel into a trap. He clenched his fists, his soldier instincts suppressing the initial wave of panic. He knew this wasn't just about Anna. It was a calculated move to distract him from his methodical destruction of Carlos's operations. But the stakes had become personal now. He couldn't let her pay for his war. The wind howled outside as Daniel retrieved a worn duffel bag from his closet. Inside were remnants of a life he'd tried to leave behind. Tactical gear, a handgun, and maps marked with escape routes and choke points. His fingers lingered on the weapon. He wasn't the man he used to be, but tonight, he might have to be. The first step was gathering intel. Daniel moved quickly, reaching out to an underground contact who specialized in tracking Mafia movements. The meeting was tense. In the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, the contact handed Daniel a slip of paper. "Warehouse by the docks," the man said, his voice low. "She's there, but it's a trap. They want you alive, for now." As Daniel slipped into the night, his thoughts drifted to Anna. Over the past few weeks, they had become an unlikely team. She had been his informant, his confidant, and in fleeting moments, a reminder of the humanity he'd almost lost. Now, with her life hanging in the balance, Daniel felt an unshakable resolve. Failure wasn't an option. Arriving at his base of operations, he spread out his resources: maps, communication devices, and tools to create diversions. The plan had to be precise. He couldn't simply storm the docks. Carlos's men would expect that. Instead, he devised a two-pronged strategy: a feigned attack at one end of the warehouse to draw the guards, while he infiltrated through an unguarded side entrance. As the clock struck midnight, Daniel reviewed his plan one last time. It was risky, but calculated. The edges of his mind buzzed with the weight of the growing danger. With each passing moment, Carlos's power seemed to loom larger, a shadow pressing down on their fragile alliance. He glanced at the faded photograph he kept tucked in his gear, a reminder of the people he'd failed to protect in the past. This time, he vowed, would be different. The streets were eerily quiet as Daniel moved into position. The wind carried the faint sound of waves crashing against the docks, mingling with the distant murmur of voices inside the warehouse. The game had begun. The air was heavy with tension as Daniel studied the list of names in front of him. Each one represented a key figure in Carlos's organization, men bound by loyalty and fear. Daniel's plan wasn't just to break their loyalty. It was to make them doubt each other. The key to dismantling a fortress wasn't always brute force. Sometimes it was the right whisper in the right ear. He started with Miguel, one of Carlos's lieutenants known for his fiery temper. Through an anonymous message, Daniel planted the idea that Raul, another trusted member of the group, was embezzling money from their operations. The message was carefully crafted, just vague enough to be believable, just specific enough to ignite suspicion. Miguel was too proud to confront Raul directly. Instead, he began watching him, his paranoia growing with each passing day. Daniel moved on to other targets, tailoring his manipulations to their weaknesses. He knew Hugo, the enforcer, was loyal but resentful, constantly overlooked for promotions. A casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance led to the suggestion that Carlos had no plans to reward him, no matter how much blood he shed. Hugo started questioning his role, his once unshakable confidence now riddled with doubt. In a dilapidated apartment across the city, Daniel leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his face. The first seeds of discontent had been sown, but he knew Carlos wasn't a fool. The man would sense the cracks forming in his foundation. That was the beauty of this game. It wasn't just about deception, it was about anticipation. Daniel had to think 3 moves ahead. Carlos, on the other hand, wasn't idle. His instincts told him something was wrong. The friction among his men was too sudden, too calculated. He ordered private meetings, testing their loyalty, reading their body language. But even he couldn't pinpoint the source of the unrest. The whispers Daniel had started were like smoke, impossible to grasp yet suffocating in their presence. The mental warfare escalated. Carlos began spreading his own disinformation, feeding his men stories of betrayal to flush out the real culprit. He didn't know it was Daniel, but he was determined to find the snake in his midst. The mistrust spread like wildfire, each man eyeing the others with suspicion. Daniel watched from the shadows, careful not to overplay his hand. His goal wasn't just to weaken Carlos, it was to make him implode. As the tension mounted, small cracks became fractures. Arguments broke out during meetings, alliances shifted, and the once cohesive group began to splinter. By the end of the week, Miguel and Raul nearly came to blows in front of Carlos. Hugo stopped showing up to meetings altogether. Carlos's frustration simmered just beneath the surface. For every move he made, Daniel was already 2 steps ahead. In the quiet of his safe house, Daniel scribbled notes on his next moves. The war wasn't over, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The chaos had begun, and it was only the beginning. Daniel stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his chest. The map spread across the table marked the culmination of weeks of searching, following leads that often seemed to dissolve into nothing. But this time he was certain. Carlos's hideout, a decayed warehouse on the outskirts of the city, was circled in red ink, its position seared into Daniel's mind like a brand. He glanced at Anna, who was perched on the edge of the couch, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but low. "This is where he's hiding." Anna's eyes darted to the map, then back to him. "Are you sure?" she asked, though the determination in Daniel's face left little room for doubt. "Positive," he replied. "All the pieces fit. The location, the patterns, the timing, it all points here. He won't be expecting me this soon." As he spoke, Daniel began to gather his gear. The bulletproof vest, the small arsenal of weapons, and a weathered backpack he'd relied on countless times before. Each item felt heavier than usual, carrying the silent promise of what lay ahead. Anna stood and approached him, her movements hesitant but deliberate. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We can find another way, another plan." "There is no other way," Daniel said firmly, though the words carried more resignation than conviction. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch both comforting and final. "Carlos has taken too much. This ends tonight." Anna searched his face, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. "And what if you don't come back?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, an unspoken truth neither wanted to confront. Daniel hesitated, the weight of her words sinking deep. "Then you keep going," he said quietly. "You take the evidence, expose him, and make sure his reach doesn't spread any further." The silence between them was broken only by the muffled sounds of the city outside. Anna's hands clenched into fists as she fought back tears. "I can't lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "You're stronger than you think," Daniel replied, his gaze unwavering. "But if I don't try, I'll lose myself." The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in as the finality of their conversation settled over them. Daniel shouldered his bag and took a deep breath. "Wait," Anna said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small charm, its metal surface glinting faintly in the dim light. "For luck," she said, pressing it into his hand. Daniel nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you," he said, tucking it into his pocket. He moved toward the door, his steps purposeful but heavy. Turning back one last time, he met Anna's eyes. "No matter what happens, this ends tonight." Without waiting for a response, Daniel stepped into the night, the door clicking shut behind him. The final confrontation was only hours away. The night cloaked the abandoned factory in an eerie stillness. Shadows stretched across cracked walls and piles of rusted machinery, concealing Daniel as he crept through the labyrinthine corridors. His every movement was calculated, each step silent, each breath measured. The glow of a single bulb flickering in the distance marked his destination, the heart of Carlos's operations, a room fortified by walls of steel and guarded by layers of armed men. Daniel's hand hovered over his holstered pistol, but his real weapon was his mind. A quick glance at his watch confirmed his precise timing. Moments earlier, he had set off a decoy explosion near the rear entrance, drawing several guards away from the main hall. Now the remaining men, fewer and disoriented, stood between him and Carlos. The first guard never saw him coming. A swift blow to the temple rendered him unconscious, and Daniel eased the body to the ground without a sound. The second guard turned too late, his shout muffled by Daniel's iron grip. The element of surprise was his ally, but the path ahead remained perilous. The closer he moved to Carlos's command room, the heavier the air became. Memories of Anna's warnings echoed in his mind. This isn't just about Carlos. If you go in alone, you might not come out. But Daniel knew this was the only way. Carlos had to be stopped, and with him, the Mafia empire that had terrorized the city for years. Reaching the steel door, Daniel paused, listening. Voices murmured inside. Carlos's distinct tone, deep and commanding, carried over the others. Daniel knew there would be no second chances. He pressed a small charge against the lock, stepping back as the explosion cracked the silence and sent the door flying inward. Chaos erupted. Carlos's men scrambled for their weapons, but Daniel was faster. The room filled with deafening gunfire, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos. Daniel moved like a phantom, striking with deadly precision. Years of training culminated in this moment. Every instinct honed, every muscle attuned to the fight. But Carlos was no ordinary foe. As Daniel fought his way forward, Carlos lunged at him, a knife gleaming in his hand. Their bodies collided, the force sending them crashing into a desk. Pain seared through Daniel's side as the blade found its mark. But he gritted his teeth, his focus unwavering. With a burst of strength, he disarmed Carlos, the knife clattering to the floor. The two men faced off, bloodied and exhausted. Carlos sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You think this ends with me? You're just a shadow chasing ghosts." Daniel didn't respond. With a calculated strike, he delivered the final blow. Carlos crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The fight was over, but the toll on Daniel was evident. Blood soaked his shirt, each breath a struggle. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. For a moment, Daniel tensed, but relief washed over him as Anna appeared, a satchel of documents in hand. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, but there was no time for hesitation. "These," she said, holding up the satchel, "are everything we need. Bank accounts, deals, names. This will bring the entire operation down." Daniel nodded weakly, his vision blurring. "Good," he managed to say, his voice strained. "Then it's done." Anna moved quickly, pressing her hand to his wound. "Not yet. You're not dying on me, Daniel." The factory seemed to exhale, its oppressive weight lifting as the reality of Carlos's demise settled. Sirens wailed in the distance, backup finally arriving, though too late to be of any help. Anna waved them down, ensuring the evidence reached the authorities. Days later, Daniel sat in the shadows of an unmarked safe house, his wounds bandaged, but his resolve unbroken. The city's headlines proclaimed the fall of Carlos's empire, hailing Anna as a hero. Daniel's name, however, remained absent, a ghost in the fight against the darkness. He stared at the walls, his mind already working. This wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning. The city needed more than a fleeting victory. It needed warriors, trained and prepared to stand against the tide of corruption. Daniel vowed to stay hidden, dedicating himself to a new mission, to find and train others, ensuring that the shadows no longer held sway over the innocent. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Daniel rose. His path was clear, even if the scars of this battle would remain forever etched in his soul. The fight wasn't over, not for him, and not for those he would lead into the fray. The story of Daniel reminds us that true strength isn't just about skill or bravery. It's about making the hardest choices, even when the odds are against us. Would you have the courage to face the shadows of your past like Daniel did? Or would the weight of fear hold you back? Life constantly tests our limits, and the choices we make define the legacy we leave behind. Click on the video on your screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and uncover more lessons from stories that challenge and inspire. Don't forget to subscribe for more content that pushes you to think, grow, and act. Your next step begins here. See you in the next video.